Chapter 3. It wasn't fun being king. Shockingly enough, it was very, very not fun being king. Galangar's long day started with getting dressed, a process that required the assistance of several people sworn to secrecy. Why? Because wearing comfortable clothing was untoward. Every morning, he let the royal stylist take the job he had been doing his entire life, pulling his hair into overly complicated braids. These days, he tried to avoid his face in the mirror. More and more, he was avoiding his face these days. It didn't look like him, the person reflected. Hair perfect, makeup done, clothes worth more than his entire savings. That was another issue. The clothes. After much insisting, he had managed to convince the royal tailor to make things that were less restricting, less gaudy. Galangar had never hated feeling like a doll more in his life. Soon enough, and with enough insisting, clothes had become more flowing, loose enough that he could move without feeling like his chest was caving in. The doctor had, after all, forbidden him from flattening his chest any more, so this helped obscure his form somewhat. Little things. Little things. At least there wasn't anything strenuous that needed his attention. Usually. Worry still churned in the bottom of his stomach. The terror in Hastion's eyes had been chilling. The man fully believed Galangar was going to beat him. Or worse. It made him sick, the very thought. He was not that kind of person. Would never be that kind of person. There wasn't a single problem that would be resolved with beating the man who had so kindly assisted him without complaint for so long. Borrowing someone's voice was no small favor. Galangar knew that well enough. At least the guilt helped keep him sane. Every day in the palace was exactly the same, and today was no exception. As he smiled and nodded through his morning meetings, taking notes to look through with his wife later, Galangar let his mind wander. Nothing important was going to be said right now. This gathering was more to give the noble families the illusion that they had some role in the decision-making process than anything concrete. That they simply spoke over Galangar and addressed all questions directly to his guard, forgetting that the king could hear them perfectly well, had to be his least favorite part of the ordeal, though. On a happier note, the anniversary of Hastion's position as captain of the guard was coming up soon. About to be 13 months of guarding in just a couple of weeks, when Darakaz ended. Galangar should do something nice for him. Some cake and a party. It was the right thing to do. The only issue would be getting preferences out of the man. Training had emphasized how much he was to please his king, so any answer he got was the answer he thought his king wanted to hear. Hastion was maddeningly well trained, despite Galangar's best efforts. Ser Hastion, he signed, not caring that he was interrupting a nobleman bragging about how his child had been admitted into the Academy of Magics, as if there was a doubt that the child would be taken in to begin with. His guard blinked at him, voice hushed so as not to bother anyone. "Yes, my lord." "Sign with me." He couldn't help accepting his fate. Oh, how could Galangar help that his guard was so sweet like this? It took everything in him not to brush his hair out of his face, if only to see that pretty blush as he realized just how much his king... what? Loved? That right word for it. Not in millennia. Lusted after just made him sound like he neither cared nor wished to care about his partner. Pined for? Gods, that was sappy enough that Galangar could taste the sugar on his tongue. Hastion was simply a good man. A handsome man. A man with a pretty voice and strong hands and ears that betrayed his emotions every chance they got. Outside of his mind, he was being spoken to. "All right, my lord, as you wish." Hastion's signs were unsure and hesitant, out of practice and out of his element. Just Galangar is fine, really. Now, to be clever with these questions. "I was wondering, do you have any allergies?" "Not clever, Gal. Not clever." Hastion paled. No, sir. He was getting much better at that, really. May I ask why you are inquiring? Curiosity. Replying as innocuously as he could, Gallagher leaned back into his plush chair. I simply realized we do not speak frequently enough. Do you have any food preferences? A deep uncertainty wove its way through Hastion's features. I am not partial to chocolate, sir. Important to know. Chocolate was right out then. Poor Malidor. I see. What about vanilla or Catrione extract? Do you like those? I would say I like Catrione and vanilla, yes, though Catrione a bit more. Hastion chewed on his lip, eyes wandering down to his own hands. Forgive my insolence, but I'm afraid I can't see why you are worrying yourself about this, sir. Surely there are more important things than your guard's taste and flavors. Nonsense. We speak so rarely, and I seek to remedy— Oh, look at Lord Aquina. I think she's going to lose her temper. Two pairs of eyes fixed on the elven noblewoman as a vein bulged on her neck. She was angry. Very angry. Let it not be said that these meetings couldn't be fun at times. Everyone knew Aquina was dealing with her anger with a therapist, issues only made worse by the change in leadership. More than anything she despised Gallagher and Malidor, though for different reasons. One could find her preaching about how the Queen was too soft on prisoners, the first to bring up Gallagher's less-than-ideal situation. Truly incredible was how she managed to blame him for the dissolution of her marriage. The elven whore, as she had taken to calling him, seemed to have a great deal of power and influence, considering that her husband's feet had been rather chilly at the wedding to begin with. Not that Gallagher had gotten into anyone's pants. He wouldn't go for her husband, who was twice his age, mind you, if his life depended on it. At least Malidor had managed to neuter any blackmail she'd had. Looks like we're about to have a show. No point keeping the smile off of his face. Gallagher would be blamed for this anyway, despite not saying a word. Hastion was less excited, nerves clear on his face. Would you like me to break it up, sir? Oh, there's no need. Any moment now. Lord Aquina will burn herself out, look profoundly ashamed, blame me for whatever ails her, and then storm out. That is oddly specific. Tipping his head up at Hastion, Gallagher did his best to portray confusion. You haven't noticed how every general meeting goes? After that, everything goes back to normal. We do announcements, and then we all leave for our other duties. Speaking of which, we will need to stop at the library after this. I need a few books for something I'm working on. I see, sir. Well, it was odd, Gallagher supposed. Not many would be bored enough to find patterns in how meetings went. Even odder was his change of course. Most days after his scheduled meetings, Gallagher would either retire to his chambers or go for a walk in the courtyard, always supervised by a guard. A stop at the library wasn't a common occurrence. Not that Hastion seemed to mind. It must have been intolerable for him, this monotony day in and day out. Of course, Gallagher wasn't going to tell him what his project was about. There was a limit to trust, after all, and he didn't fancy himself thrown out of the palace after another revolt.
I have had enough of this nonsense. Why we must sit and listen to you speak more and more of your bastard child, I do not understand.
What all the trouble was, Gallagher couldn't understand. In his opinion, it was decently brave of Theriot to keep his half-elf child, especially in Estren's time. Yes, the king understood that Aquina had become accustomed to being able to make digs at his expense whenever she wanted, but there had to be a limit. Before he could say, matriarch of a family far more powerful than the two of them. Interesting. It seemed the summer heat had gotten to all of them this week, tensions fraying under the onslaught. Lord Akina, please, must we listen to you after all this time? There was a dangerous edge to her voice. A century you have sat here and repeated the same thing over and over. This is a cordial meeting meant for us to discuss our dealings and forge new alliances, not your personal podium. While I applaud our great king's patience with you, mine has run out. Politely, shut up. Anger dripped from her voice like snow in the thaw, and Akina shrank down into meltwater. Lord Adeli was not one to speak frequently, only updating the court on the barest essentials and nodding along as people spoke to her for whatever reason. An outburst like this was very out of the ordinary, especially in such a relaxed meeting. Weather really played no small element in it, Galangar was sure. It was positively sweltering outside, the sun beaming down through the large windows to play across the curtains. Everything was hot, the palace rooms included. No relief could be found, and the great outdoors was even worse. Anything the Arcanist synthesized was nowhere near enough, not for this heat wave. In however many years he'd lived here, Galangar had never seen a summer so unlivable. He was going to melt into a puddle. How was he expected to survive this? Knocking on the table to get everyone's attention, Galangar began to sign, Hastion repeating after him. The few that could understand sign watched their king politely following along. Lord Adeli, I understand that this can be frustrating. It can feel quite aggravating down. Some of the anger ebbed out, face set in annoyance as she obliged him. As for Lord Akina, if there is an issue with something, please, I implore you to bring it up. That is the reason we have these meetings in the first place. The only emotion in her form was the twitch of her ear. Of course, my king. Thank you for your patience and tolerance. Of course. Now if anyone has any announcements, now would be the time to declare them. Galangar eased back in his seat, idly running his fingers along the wood of his armrest as everyone smoothed their ruffled feathers. I have something. Tarioke's voice piped up, smile plain on his face. I would like to announce my new engagement. Well, that certainly got everyone's attention. Tarioke hadn't been on the market since his husband was executed decades ago. The very concept of him even courting someone was inconceivable, never mind a marriage. No one had even heard word of him looking for a partner. Not from noble stock, at least. Shocking. Shocking and interesting. Soldiering on, ignoring the way eyes widened in surprise, he let nothing stop him. I'm sure you all have questions, but I am happy with my choice. We are currently planning the wedding, and I am sure you will all receive invitations once we have fleshed it out more. I am confident he would love to meet you all once he is more settled in. Unexpected, especially the way he spoke of his new fiancée. There was an edge, one that rubbed Galangar the wrong way. It was almost certainly nothing. That, or simply posturing. But he didn't like it. Congratulations. He put on as close to a genuine smile as he could, eyes crinkling. Tarioke hadn't had a good run recently. Maybe this would be good for him. There had been rumors that his son had grown into a troubled child. I hope you two will have a long and happy life together. If I may ask, what is his name? A look of surprise crossed Tarioke's face. Oh, my apologies. I forgot completely. His name is Vakino. Vakino Tremlin. That was familiar. Why was that familiar? Galangar didn't just know random names that weren't in the court. It couldn't have been from the Northwest Territories, and it definitely wasn't from the palace. It wasn't... Reykjani. He had heard it in Reykjani. The realization sent a chill down Galangar's spine as he fought sudden nausea. A tremble worked its way into his hands as he kept his breathing relatively calm. Vakino Tremlin, his mind informed him, dredging up memories he was far happier forgetting, had been an elven man from the Norde that had been placed in his barrack. He'd had a partner when he was thrown into the camps, and was convinced that she would lobby for his freedom. It had crushed his soul to find out that she was the one to turn him in, enough that he didn't eat, didn't sleep for days. He started out as a strong man, long, fair hair coming down around his waist in well-kept braids. His eyes had been clear and determined, shining with the very force of his personality. Last time Galangar saw him, Vakino had become a starved, silent man, clipped hair falling out in patches and growing back white. He had stopped speaking, stopped responding to words that were not orders. Their superiors had gotten to work hollowing him out, stripping him of all that had made him such a vibrant companion. The king had been silent for too long. People were beginning to stare. "A lovely name. I'm sure you two will be happy together." He forced his smile more, while Hastion shifted, repeating the words with his eyes on his king. "Thank you, my lord." Placation graced Teriok's face, doing nothing to soothe Galangar. "If I may only have as pleasant a marriage as you." It was comedic how Teriok acted as if nothing were wrong, telling jokes. With a silent chuckle, more to himself than anyone, Galangar inclined his head. He might as well try to remain in the present. A marriage is only as pleasant as the party's conviction to make it so. That got a few nervous laughs, relieved that the topic had shifted. Despite his royal status, Galangar was not immune to rumors of how soulless his marriage must have been, tied to the stony-faced queen. They were wrong, of course. Just because they didn't understand how to properly interpret Malador's emotions didn't mean she had none. Their marriage was perfectly happy, if crowded in with work. At least the two of them knew how to speak with one another effectively, which was better than most of the people gathered here. He still couldn't center himself. Dark thoughts stalked the corners of his mind, warnings and paranoia creeping across his skin like frost over the ground. No matter how many times he assured himself of his safety, his status, his protection, they were still there, whispering omens of ill fortune in ragged, raspy voices. No one was going to drag him back, kicking and screaming. He had been promised that over and over again until some shred of himself believed it. His wife would fight tooth and nail for him. She would tear down the camps herself until her skin broke and her hands bled into the thirsty soil. He was safe here, even if the ground had not been satiated after year upon year of sacrifice. And yet, what if, still echoed in his mind, a distraction to end all distractions. Outside his swirling thoughts, the conversation passed on, complete with his placid nodding and polite comments from him. A few years of meetings meant Galangar had polite listening down to a science, even when he wasn't really listening. It was all the same conversation with different blanks filled in. Something happened to someone. Someone's son was a fan of a sailor boy. Someone's daughter was going to this or that academy. It was nonsense. But it was comforting nonsense. Soon enough, people were exchanging their goodbyes and wishing each other well. Hastion ready to walk Galangar to wherever he wanted to go. Though Galangar's head was clearing some, fear ebbing away into all too familiar exhaustion, his guard's form still held some trepidation, worry buzzing at his edges. Ah, he was concerned. How adorable. And how unnecessary. "Is there somewhere in particular you would like me to take you, aside from the library, sir?" His voice was hushed, just loud enough for his king to hear. The queen mentioned that a walk through the gardens might be nice. If Malador was suggesting his guard take him on walks, it meant that Galangar was spending too much time working. Tomorrow, then, weather permitting. That is, unless my wife was intending to walk with me. Not likely, with all the meetings she had today. Chewing on his lip, Hastion was the spitting image of Mollified as they set out, striding through the busy halls of the palace to the library. The Queen did not assert anything of the sort. No, sir. Right, then. It would be best to go back to my chambers after I pick up my books. I have a few things that need doing, but if I finish early, a walk may be nice. And then, after a moment's hesitation, though the evening may be better. It's a scorcher today, isn't it? Yes, sir. He sounded more like he was agreeing with Gallangar to agree. Keeping the conversation going, he smiled up at his guard, only a little jealous at how he was nearly a head taller than him. First his wife, and now his guard. It seemed that Gallangar was destined to a life of shortness. Are you more partial to the summer or the winter? A blink was Hastion's initial response as he tried to figure out the correct answer. I have no preference in season. Really, though? With a friendly smile, Gallangar gave him the most disbelieving look he could. Everyone has at least one they hate. Hastion let a pause stretch before giving in, shame clear in his voice as his head hung. I like summer, my king. My apologies for misleading you. The way he said it was like a man off to the gallows, cold bite of the axe already at his throat. Gallangar could see his breath speed up, pulse racing as he did something so daring as voice a bit to unlearn. I'm usually a fan of summer, too, the king said, to no one that was looking. Wonderful. Clearing his throat did nothing. It was taps on Hastion's shoulder that got the man to glance at him, fear glinting in his dark eyes. I said I like summers, too, when the weather's less sweltering, that is. I see, sir. His voice sounded rough. I apologize for the heat. Silent laughter bubbled up out of Gallangar, spilling over his lips and cracking his grin wider. Oh, I was not aware you had control over that. Make sure that next winter you heat up the air like a nice day in Lictine. Please, don't apologize for things you can't control. I can hardly fault you for a sweltering day in Darrakaz. A quiet chuckle, almost too faint to be heard, slipped out of Hastion's mouth before he could stop it. His eyes widened in horror. He had laughed at the king. That had been a death sentence in decades past. Centuries past. One clearly wanted a rolling head if one even so much as giggled in the king's presence. This was a level of disrespect formerly unheard of. Good. They needed more disrespect around here. It was beginning to get stifling. It's good to know you can laugh. Gallangar kept up his easy smile, leaning into Hastion's personal space a bit. I was beginning to think I would have to juggle fruits to see you crack a smile. His mouth opened in a small, surprised sound, hands clasped tight in front of him. A blush crept up his cheeks, tinging his ears a faint pink. He really did look handsome in most anything, his ashy, tawny skin contrasting nicely with short black hair, tidily combed back. Even his uniform, a deep blue with gold accents, flattered him, highlighting his fit figure while obscuring any imperfections he had. It really was incredible how put together he managed to look at all times. Thank you, sir. When he spoke, it was in a hushed tone, as if he were afraid the words would burn up in his mouth the moment someone else heard them. For caring about those in your employ, that is. The latter half was said in a rush, as if to smooth over any offense. Gallangar shook his head. Sir Hastion, of course I care. Every day you protect me from gods only know what. It's only fair that I make it pleasant. Please, do not feel... He paused. I was not aware you worshipped the gods. Please forgive any insult. You've given me none. The arches of the library loomed before them, conversation dropping as Gallagher passed inside, being greeted by the head librarian as she worked through processing a stack of new books. It still made him sick when people bowed to him, even when he had asked them to stop. But he would have to live through this. A few signs later, books were deposited into his arms, thick and heavy, a comforting weight. Thank yous were exchanged and the two were off, Gallagher insisting on carrying things despite how it silenced him. Really, he could do one thing for himself. As they neared the door to Gallagher's chamber, dread started to pool in his chest. Too many things littered his desk to be reasonable. At least there wouldn't be too much in the way of official duties, just everything else. Well, his project was far more satisfying than any of his official duties. He could give it that. Instead of poring over document upon document, searching for an inconsistency with the math or running the numbers on which programs the kingdom could afford to add to the quickly expanding list Malidor had insisted on, Gallagher was leafing through files and hunting down people his predecessor would have preferred remained forgotten, offering the crown's support to those he could get into contact with. Survivors of the Kianis were not known for their naivete or willingness to trust anything to come from the crown. He could understand that. He really could. Not many people wanted to interact with a government that had formerly shipped them off to be worked to death or brainwashed, even if the leadership had changed. Gallagher certainly had his reserves about staying in Dalitar, never mind becoming king. The terror he had lived under before meeting Malidor had been a constant in his life, and awfully hard to forget. That being said, this was a new administration, despite how quickly people forgot, and they had been tasked with resolving the faults of the previous one. The two of them had a duty to at least try, and if it meant leafing through document upon document that had previously been marked to be destroyed, then that was what Gallagher was going to be doing, as often as possible, working through the night to give at least one person slightly more peace of mind. Without a word, Hastion opened the door for him, hesitating on the threshold as if he were unsure whether or not he was allowed inside. A pang ran through Gallagher's heart. He was a good guard, really. He was a good guard, and he deserved more than what he was getting. Afraid to even step into his charge's quarters for some pleasant conversation. Who could fault him, though? Gallagher knew the rules for being a guard, better than most, and no matter how much Malidor worked to change them, there would always be people to insist on the old way. Even still, Gallagher couldn't invite him in. Not tonight. Not with what he was planning on doing. It was best for as few prying eyes to see this as possible. It was so hard to tell where loyalties lay these days. People knew better than to declare their undying support of Asren. Wishing him a good night with one hand, Gallagher stepped into his chambers, leaving Hastion on the other side of the door. Despite the lingering guilt, he had no issue setting up his work for the day, arranging his books as he would likely need them. It had been a mercy how no one noticed the contexts of his reading, memoirs of people from the camps. They would help. Not much, but every little bit counted. As promised, a fresh binder of paperwork had been delivered to his room and got cracking. The brunt of it would be matching names to camps, at least, in the beginning. Then he would do his very best to match names to death records, names to locations. He had to build whole people out of ink and parchment with only the notes of a man who hated them with a burning passion, pun not intended, to go off of. It was a mostly thankless job, but there was nothing else Gallagher wanted to be doing. So, as he did every night, he buried himself in his names. Syllables that had been transliterated into higher speak were the worst to mangle out, twisting and turning into themselves enough to obscure the original one. Those from the Northwest Territories were easy enough for him to parse out, though as the person's homeland drifted south, the pronunciation just faded more and more. A knock at the door came in the middle of it all. Galangar had been tracing the last reported home of the family of a human woman sent to Hevekiani for birthing a child with a humanish man. That was a death sentence. Hevekiani. No, he wasn't going to dwell on her fate right now. Not when he had a visitor. Closing his book and the binder, he did his best to obscure the nature of his work, replacing it with tax documents and economic reports. Finances were an excellent disguise, if someone had the bravery to actually look at his desk, especially considering he was the mathematical branch of the royal family. Malidor had never been adept at numbers. The thought brought a smile to his face. He swung the door open to reveal Teriok, still dressed in his finery from the meeting, pleasant expression on his face unchanged. Galangar dimly heard Hastion announce him over the sound of blood rushing in his ears. There was something behind that faint smile, something threatening and dangerous. This was how Galangar was to die. This was the end of it all. Secrets had to end somewhere. My apologies, Lord, but I have some duties to attend to. Another time, though. It would be a pleasure to speak later. If your questions are time-sensitive, feel free to send a courier with a message so that I might reply when I have a free moment. He swore he could hear the squeaking of Teriok's teeth. Of course. Thank you for your time, my king. Teriok bowed politely as he excused himself, soft shoes nearly silent as he moved. He was going to remember that. Doing his best to calm himself, Galangar watched as Teriok turned the corner and disappeared. A swell of relief rose in his chest. No one would dare question the king, not even if they felt he had no right to be king, and for that he could be thankful. The royal couple had split their duties in more ways than one. Where Galangar found people and gave out reparations, Malidor kept up their image with strategic visits to this or that play, commemorating this or that statue. Really, she was quite good at it. It hurt him to put more work on his wife's plate, but she was going to have to keep an eye on Teriok. He was not known for his familial power, but this blackmail would poke more than a few holes in their plans. Malidor fussed less with appearances and more with safety. It was just how she was. The last thing she wanted was to endanger her husband, to make him a target. And here he was, putting himself in danger. With a soft sigh, Galangar turned to his guard. Ser Hastion. His hands moved without much input from him. Please, would you like to come in? I wouldn't want to overstep. Surprise ran through his guard's words like a thread through a seam. What must this look like to him? His charge being discreetly threatened and doing nothing to defend his honor. It was a joke. Dark gray eyes met charcoal black. I wouldn't call it overstepping if I'm inviting you. You could help me stay focused on my work if you like. A pause hung in the air while he thought, words and ideas and propriety turning over in his head in one big soup. One of these days, he was going to bite right through his lip with that chewing habit. Galangar was certain of it. Only minutes later, though, Hastion was passing through the doorframe into a place once forbidden to those not gracing the king's bed. He was tense, yes. The thought of a punishment still hung heavy in the man's head, despite his king's best efforts. But no more tense than always, sitting obediently wherever his king gestured as Galangar tried to figure out something less treasonous that he would need help with. Well, his wife had asked him to look at a series of plays to figure out which ones they should make appearances at. Yes, that was enough. The added benefit of relieving her of some stress. Little things piled atop each other here and there, like stones plugging a river. Lighting his face with a friendly smile, Galangar sat down in his chair and took out the folder Malidor had sent to him, skimming over titles he had no loyalties to. So, Ser Hastion, what do you know of plays?